Picture this. You crash land on an alien planet. You die. And instead of a game over screen, you wake up back at the crash site. Same planet, different layout, different monsters, and somehow it feels like you've been here before. Not in this run, in your life. That's Returnal. And 4 years after it came out, people are still arguing about what actually happened in it. That's not a coincidence. That's the whole point.
So let's back up. Returnal was made by a Finnish studio called Housemarque, guys who'd spent over 2 decades making tight, twitchy arcade shooters, games like Resogun and Nex Machina. Small teams, big scores, no story to speak of. Then Sony bought them, handed them a real budget, and basically said, go big. And Housemarque's answer was this insane hybrid nobody asked for. Take a bullet hell shooter, the kind where the screen fills up with pink and red projectiles you have to dance through, and fuse it with a roguelike, where every time you die, the level rebuilds itself from scratch. You play Celine, a scout for a company called Astra, who crash lands on a planet called Atropos while chasing a mysterious signal she calls the White Shadow. She finds her own dead body, multiple versions of it, and she realizes she's stuck in a loop. Die, wake up at the ship, do it again. Planet slightly rearranged each time.
Here's the thing that made critics lose their minds in 2021. This shouldn't have worked as well as it did. Bullet hell games are usually 2D, top-down, simple. Roguelikes are usually slower, more methodical, turn-based even. Returnal takes both of those and jams them into a fast, third-person shooter where you're dodging spinning rings of alien projectiles while also managing loot, weapon upgrades, and this brutal risk-reward system called parasites, items that give you a huge buff but come with a nasty drawback attached. Every run is a gamble. And then there's the tech side, which people forget mattered so much. This came out at PS5 launch, and it was basically the tech demo for what the DualSense controller could actually do. Rain falls on Atropos, and you feel individual raindrops through the haptics. The adaptive triggers give you a soft click for aiming and a hard push through for an Alt-IR mode. 2 functions on 1 trigger, and your hand can physically tell the difference. And the audio team went all in on 3D sound, to the point where you can hear an enemy behind a wall and know exactly where it is before you see it. None of that was gimmicky. It was built into how you survive.
Now here's where Returnal stops being just a really good shooter and starts being something else. Because on paper, you're stuck in a time loop on an alien planet sounds like 100 other games. What makes this one land differently is what it's actually about underneath the sci-fi skin. Quick warning, I'm going to get into story stuff here, so if you haven't finished it, you might want to skip ahead a couple minutes. As you push through the game, you keep finding these audio logs and scout journals, some written by Celine, some seemingly written by other versions of Celine from past loops. And slowly it becomes clear this isn't really a story about an astronaut. It's a story about a woman named Celine who, back on Earth, was driving one night with her daughter in the car, got distracted, swerved to avoid something in the road, and crashed. The whole planet, the monsters, the crumbling structures, even a literal house from her childhood that keeps appearing out of nowhere in the jungle, starts to look less like an alien world and more like a mind working through grief and guilt it can't escape. The ending doesn't spell any of this out directly, and that's deliberate. Housemarque has said outright that they wanted players walking away with different readings of it. Some people see it as literal. Celine's ship malfunctioned and trapped her in an actual time loop. Others read the entire planet as a psychological space, something closer to purgatory, built entirely out of trauma. There's even a secret, harder-to-reach ending that complicates things further and suggests she might finally break the cycle. The game never picks a side. It just gives you the pieces. That ambiguity is why this story still gets picked apart on forums years later. It respects the player enough to not handhold them through the meaning of it.
Let's talk tech for a second, because Returnal was one of the earliest PS5 exclusives that actually proved what the console could do, not just what it could say on a spec sheet. At launch, it targeted 4K resolution at a steady 60 frames per second with ray tracing active, and back in 2021, that combination was genuinely rare. Most PS5 games at the time had to pick between resolution, frame rate, or ray tracing. Returnal tried to hold all 3 at once, and mostly pulled it off thanks to a dynamic resolution system that would scale down slightly under heavy load instead of tanking the frame rate.
But here's the interesting part. The ray tracing hardware in the PS5 wasn't just being used for shiny reflections. Housemarque's tech director explained that the RT hardware was actually accelerating their global illumination system, which is what makes the alien jungles and crumbling structures on Atropos look lit from within rather than flatly painted. And because the levels regenerate every run, that lighting system had to adapt to random layouts in real time. It couldn't be baked in advance like most games do. The RT hardware also fed into the audio engine. Sound queries got accelerated the same way light does, which is part of why the 3D audio in this game feels so precise. You can hear a creature's growl bounce correctly off a wall you haven't even turned toward yet. Years later, when the PS5 Pro launched, Returnal got a patch boosting resolution up to nearly 1440p at its peak, a 2.5 times pixel count increase, while holding that 60 FPS target. And on PC, the 2023 port added full ray traced reflections on top of everything else, plus support for ultra-wide monitors and higher refresh rates if your hardware could push past 60. For a game built by a studio that spent 20 years making small arcade shooters, Returnal wasn't just a visual showcase. It used its graphics tech to serve the actual gameplay loop, randomized levels that still had to look and sound intentional every single time.
Critically, this thing was a near unanimous hit. Reviewers called it the best game on PS5 at the time. And that wasn't just hype talk. It landed 93 on Metacritic and mostly stayed there. But here's a fun bit of drama. When the Game Awards 2021 nominations came out, Returnal only got 3 nods: Best Game Direction, Best Audio Design, Best Action Game, and missed Game of the Year entirely. A lot of critics and fans called that a straight-up snub, especially since it lost even Best Action Game that night to Metroid Dread. But Returnal got its redemption a few months later. At the BAFTA Games Awards in 2022, it didn't just get nominated for Best Game, it won Best Game outright and walked away with 4 awards total, more than anything else that ceremony. It also picked up the Breakthrough Award at the Golden Joystick Awards that same year. So while the American award circuit kind of shrugged at it, the wider industry eventually caught up and recognized it for what it actually was, one of the most ambitious games of that generation.
For 2 years, Returnal was locked to PS5, which honestly hurt how many people actually experienced it. Then, in February 2023, it finally landed on PC, built with Climax Studios, and it brought proper PC trimmings with it. Ultra-wide support, ray trace reflections, Dolby Atmos, and yeah, if you plug in a DualSense controller on PC, you still get the haptics and adaptive triggers. That release let a whole second wave of players discover it, years after launch, and the response was basically the same. This is unlike anything else out there. And that's really the case for why it belongs in the greatest sci-fi games ever conversation. It's not just that Atropos looks incredible, with 6 wildly different biomes that all feel alien in their own specific way. It's that Returnal uses its genre, the loop, the death, the repetition, as the actual language of its story. In most games, dying is a punishment, a mechanical failure state that interrupts the story. In Returnal, dying is the story. Every death is Celine reliving the same unresolved moment over and over, unable to move past it until she understands it. The gameplay and the narrative aren't sitting next to each other. They're the same thing. That's rare, genuinely rare. Most sci-fi games tell you a story and then let you play a shooter on the side. Returnal makes the shooting mechanics themselves carry the emotional weight of grief and repetition, and the terror of not being able to escape your own head. That's why people who finished it don't just remember the bosses or the guns. They remember how it made them feel by the credits.
So is Returnal one of the greatest sci-fi games ever made? I'd argue yes, not because it invented the roguelike or the bullet hell shooter, but because it's one of the only games that ever made those genres mean something. It took a mechanic built around failure and turned it into a meditation on grief that still gets people theorizing 4 years later. If you've played it, I want to know which ending you landed on and what you think actually happened to Celine. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this video helped you see the game a little differently, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of these breakdowns coming.